So welcome back to part 2 to rational choice theory. We are in chapter 4, and my part 1 video really broke down what is rational choice theory. So rational choice theory is the notion that the offender will weigh the pros against the cons, the benefits against the costs, the risks against the rewards, in the idea or the decision to commit crime. If the benefits and the pros and the rewards outweigh the risks and the cons and the costs, then you have crime. If they don't, you don't have crime. And so we left off in the first part talking about ethics and morals. And if you did not watch the first part of the lecture, please stop this one, go back and watch that one, and then pick it up. So we're asking ourselves, is crime truly rational, right? Well, it's very easy to illustrate whether or not crimes are products of rational objective thought because, generally speaking, as I shared in that first part, crime is very much offender specific. In other words, offenders will weigh those pros versus cons, etc. We don't need to go over that, but they will very much determine whether they have the skills and the tactics and the moxie, so to speak, to commit crime. So you have to consider these questions and give yourself, answer these questions kind of subconsciously. Is drug use rational? Is it rational to be violent? Are there ever instances where hate crime is rational? Even sex crimes, are those rational? So can we argue, is crime truly rational? Do people weigh the pros and cons to doing some of these things that I pointed out? And again, these are thoughts that I want you to ponder and consider, not just in the rest of this lecture, but beyond as you go through life. So if we analyze rational choice theory, we understand that crime is not a random event, but the product of calculation and planning. Remember what I said? Offenders will plan to commit crime. So they don't just wake up. No one woke up today and said, you know what, this is a great day. I think I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to commit a crime. No, it's not generally random. Yes, there may be some random elements to the crime, but from what criminologists say, remember, criminologists are the individuals who study the nature and extent and the reason why criminals or individuals commit crime. That's what a criminologist is. That's what they do. For the most part, understand that crime is just not a random event, right? There's some calculation. There's some planning. A person has to weigh the benefit. They have to see whether or not what they're going to do is going to be beneficial to them. And so the key to remember is that criminals are decision makers and they spend their time calculating profit and risk. When looking at being a decision maker, generally speaking, they are focusing on, is this going to be profitable to me? Or is there going to be an inherent risk associated here that I should be aware of and that I have to deal with, right? So that's one of the things that is noteworthy, okay? So let's talk about crime prevention, right? If a criminal is going to weigh the pros and cons to committing a crime, then we have to do our part as society to try to deter that individual from committing a crime. This is easier said than done, class, because you can't stop what somebody's going to do. Let me say that again. You can't stop what someone is going to do. So when I worked in law enforcement, again, one of my buddies was the crime prevention deputy. A lot of some of this lecture are bits and pieces of key tenets that he used in talking about crime and in working to prevent crime in our community. So I utilize that in my lecture because it's great information. It's really great to talk about. We can do our part. We can do our part. Again, we're not going to do everything to stop crime and stop criminals, but we can do our part. So ring cameras, I have a ring camera that looks just like that you see on your screen. Having security systems, making your space so defensible that the crime is going to be prevented because people are going to work so hard to ensure that it's going to be a task for the criminal to get into the space. So having security, having surveillance, there's a number of things that you can do personally. There's a number of things that you can do to ensure that you are not going to allow there's a number of things you can do to ensure that you're not going to allow yourself to become a victim, or you're not going to allow your home to become victimized, so to speak. So you have to work on having defensible spaces, and the situational crime prevention is noteworthy too, because again, you're looking to control the means of how crime can be committed. Just having a camera will deter somebody because they don't want to be caught, right? They know that if they're monitored, somebody can see their face. And with some facial recognition programs that exist now that law enforcement can use, hey, you turn over that camera, and if law enforcement runs it through a facial recognition program, they can find out who you are, and now they're going after you. So some criminals don't want to be caught, and therefore just the camera alone is enough to make them say, yeah, I'm going to think twice before I go up to this residence or try to break into this home. Now, again, looking at the crime prevention strategies, increase the effort needed to commit crime, increase the risk of committing crime, certainly reducing rewards of crime. Inducing guilt is a big thing, because when looking at guilt, if you can make people feel guilty about, do you really want to break into the home of the little old lady down the street who is so sweet and so kind, who might, maybe when you were younger gave you cookies, or, talked to your parents and was always kind, and when you went to her house for Halloween, she gave you some of the best candy bars, and then now you want to break into her home? Do you want to do that? You have somebody in your circle say, come on, man, we're not going to do that to her. Come on. She's a great person. We're not going to do that. Inducing guilt, increasing shame, the shame of how it would feel to know that people see you as a thief, see you as a criminal. How would you walk around, being labeled as such? And we'll talk about labeling. In fact, there's something called labeling theory we'll get to in a few chapters. It's a very good theory to look at. But either way, these crime prevention strategies are very important, because if they are properly utilized, you won't have a crime. You may still have crimes, but at least in this instance, you won't have a crime. So if we have to evaluate situational crime prevention, of course, there are pros and cons. Let's look at the pros, right? The hidden benefits. Diffusion. This is an effect that occurs when efforts to prevent one crime unintentionally prevents another. So, when we look at diffusion, think about the fact that if you start having maybe, increased patrol in an area, and law enforcement, with the increased patrol, if somebody was going to be in the area and was potentially not only thinking about robbing somebody, but maybe they were going to consider an assault, taking the woman or taking the person by force. Well, now you've just diffused that situation, because now not only will women be safer and people will be safer in an area, they don't have to get robbed, but they also aren't getting assaulted in that manner. So that's diffusion. Discouragement, an effect that occurs when crime control efforts targeting a particular locale help reduce crime in surrounding areas and populations. So once again, heavy police presence will discourage people from coming in there and committing crimes, because, hey, we know that area is swarming with cops. Cops are everywhere. It's swarming with cops. So yeah, the whole area is safe. The whole locale, the whole location is safe, and crime is significantly reduced because of the heavy police presence. So that is discouragement. Now, here are some of the cons, right? Or here are some of the costs. First of all, displacement occurs when crime control efforts in one location simply move or redirect offenders to less heavily guarded targets. If you're in a major college town, right, or you're in a party area, right? So let's say, downtown Atlanta, right? For me, downtown Atlanta, a lot of people out there, a lot going on. You have a lot of major attractions in walking distance. You have the the I call it the Atlanta Eye, but it's the Ferris wheel. You have, CNN, World of Coke, the Aquarium, you have State Farm Arena, Mercedes-Benz Stadium, like all in the same area. A lot of eateries, a lot to do, lots of fun places to go. College Football Hall of Fame, all in the same area. Well, we have heavy Atlanta police presence down there. A whole lot of Atlanta police and Fulton County Sheriff's Office all down there. Then guess what? People are going to be displaced, so the targets will move further out away from that. Even though you're going to have more people and more potential targets for victimization, you're going to have some people that are going to wander outside of the safe zone, so to speak, and those are the people that you would target. So that's where displacement comes into play. Extinction. When crime reduction programs produce a short-term positive effect, but benefits dissipate as criminals adjust to new conditions. So burglars will always learn how to dismantle alarms. The Ring doorbell cameras are great. They pick people up, but what a person will do is they'll probably really conceal their face. And who knows, if they're really, really crafty, they might just throw something over the Ring camera. And that way, when they kick the door in, the camera won't see them coming out and you might not even see whatever stuff they've stolen, right? So again, eventually criminals have to adjust to those conditions. And then lastly, replacement. When criminals try new offenses to replace those neutralized by crime prevention efforts. If I know I'm going to want to commit several burglaries and I know that the businesses have substantial alarm systems, they are harder targets, they're greater defensible spaces, well, then maybe instead of committing the burglary, maybe I just decide to go ahead and, maybe do some, breaking into cars, maybe I even decide to try to steal some cars, grand theft of a motor vehicle. Like I have to adjust or replace what I was going to do with some other criminal act to fulfill my needs. So when we look at deterrence, and if you are a criminology major or you study criminal justice, you probably have heard of deterrence, right? If you haven't, then let me just go over it in simple terms. So we have general deterrence and we have specific deterrence. General deterrence is this fear of criminal penalties convinces a potential law violator that the pains of crime outweigh its benefits. So the easiest way to view this class is that you have to think about the general public. What does the general public say about crime? What is the general public's view on committing a crime? Generally speaking, the general public says that if you break the law, if you commit a crime, then for the most part, you will be punished, right? We know that. I mean, we live in the United States of America. You can't just go around breaking the law and thinking there's no consequences. Some people do it now. They think they're above the law, but that's a different story. But generally speaking, no, there's consequences to your actions, right? So when looking at general deterrence, this fear of criminal penalties will convince the person that they should not commit the crime because the crime outweighs the benefits. I know I'm not going to break the law because I worked in law enforcement. I don't want to be inside of a jail. Now, you out here probably have never seen a jail other than what you've seen on TV, but I've been in quite a few jails in Florida, in Georgia. Nah, jail ain't a place that you want to go. I'm just being real. It's not cool. It's not a country club. It's not a club, or it's not a fun party atmosphere. It's just not fun, right? So general deterrence is what applies to you and me. It applies to all of us, and we recognize it, and we know we don't want to break the law because we know what the punishment is going to be. When looking at general deterrence, there's the marginal versus restrictive deterrence. The marginal deterrence refers to the relative effectiveness of a punishment. How effective is the punishment going to be in general, right? So most people, we break the law, we know we're going to be punished. For some of us, the first time you go to jail is the last time you go to jail because you don't want to go back, right? That's the marginal deterrence. It's effective. It's relatively effective as it relates to punishment. The restrictive deterrence, rather, refers to situations in which the threat of punishment can reduce but not eliminate the frequency, severity, and duration of a crime. Perfect example of this, speeding. You can't go driving 110 miles per hour on the interstate. Don't do it. Now, do I have students who are, a lot younger than me, like half my age, whatever the case may be, that, like, Professor Fields, it's okay to drive fast. It's fun. Do you? Do you? But let me tell you something. The first time you get that ticket from that state trooper or state police, and you see how bad that ticket is and how expensive it is, and it puts a nice dent into your wallet, $400, $500, whatever, hopefully you'll be like, I'm not doing that again, because that's a lot of money for me to lose to a law enforcement agency or to a community when I was driving, even though I was driving too fast. That's the first thing. But the second thing, and the one that you need to be very familiar with, and the one you need to be focused on, is the fact that in some instances, if you're driving too fast, they may just go ahead and take you to jail. But is that going to stop everybody from driving fast? It may stop you, but it's not going to stop everybody. In fact, as you're pulled over on the side of the road and a person's driving by and they're like, man, what did he do? What did she do? Ooh, or they see the person in handcuffs and they're like, man, they must have did something bad. But what did we do? We get well beyond the law enforcement officer, and guess what? We speed right back up. It's restricted, right? It will reduce, but it's not going to eliminate the frequency and severity and duration of the crime, because other people are still going to do it. Now, when looking at punishment, understand that it has to be certain, severe, and swift. When there's this direct relationship between crime rates and the certainty of punishment, in other words, when we have more proactive and aggressive law enforcement, it's way more effective. It's way more effective than routine patrol. When we look at the severity of punishment, people who think or believe they're going to be punished severely for a crime will forego committing criminal acts because they know that if I'm going to deal with a punishment, I'm just not going to want to commit a criminal act in general. And then think about the swiftness of punishment. It's applied rapidly and closely linked to crime. You're going to face punishment at some point. Now, sometimes punishment isn't so swift where you commit the crime, you get arrested, and you're going to get sentenced to jail or prison. No, it might take some time, but it's still swift in that, for the most part, after several months, maybe even a year, then all of a sudden the crime will, or the punishment will be met out, right? So there's that as well. But we know there's a certain severity and swiftness of punishment. Like, punishment will happen. It will occur. In fact, this is called penology, right? It's the study of punishment and the penal system, right? That's what penology focuses on. Now, the other type of deterrence that has to be considered is what's called the specific deterrence. The specific deterrence is that the view that criminal sanctions should be so powerful that offenders will never repeat their criminal acts. What specific deterrence, how it differentiates between general deterrence, is that it is specific to criminal offenders. So when we look at specific deterrence, these are our repeat offenders. These are our, I hate to use the term bad apples, but that's what they are. These are the people who can't stop breaking the law, right? They can't stop breaking the law. And yes, sometimes it doesn't work. Being punished may breed defiance rather than deterrence. In other words, you can't go ahead and keep locking up the same individual and thinking, okay, finally he's going to get it and he's going to stop. When guess what he does? He decides, you know what? It doesn't matter. I'm just going to keep on doing what I'm doing. I'm going to keep on breaking the law and doing what I'm doing, right? Even that stigma of punishment sometimes labels people. If you're going to be like, I'm labeled a criminal, then so what? I'm going to be a criminal. And again, we're going to get to labeling theory in a few chapters, but for some people, it doesn't matter. They don't care. So oftentimes that when it comes to specific deterrence, even though it's aimed and designated at those core criminals and those core offenders, for some, they don't stop because they're like, hey, I'm just going to live up to this moniker, live up to this label, and that's going to be it. So we all deal with general deterrence. We're not out there breaking the law. We're not all law violators and rule breakers. So we fall under general deterrence. But the specific deterrence is for the career criminals and for the individuals who will not stop breaking the law. So that leads us into something called incapacitation and the incapacitation effect. Incapacitation is this idea that if you're going to keep people in confinement, it's going to eliminate the risk of their committing further offenses. We oftentimes confuse incapacitation with incarceration. Incarceration means to be locked up. Incapacitation also tends to be locked up. However, the notion and the primary difference between incapacitation and incarceration is that incarceration is just all about, hey, we just want to lock you up. That's it. Incapacitation, on the other hand, says, no, we're going to eliminate the risk of further offenses because you're locked up. In other words, these are going to go hand in hand. This is going to be full tandem. We are absolutely going to benefit from the fact and the notion and the idea that if we can't stop you from breaking the law and committing new offenses, then all we're going to do is just keep you put away so you can't have the opportunity to break the law and commit new offenses. Now, yes, there's little evidence that incapacitating criminals would deter them from future criminality. Most people get in jail, get in prison, and say, I'm going to be a changed man. I'm not going to do it again. I promise I'm different. And then what do? Go right back to the same old stuff. They do it, right? Everybody finds religion when they're incarcerated. Everybody says, I'm going to be a changed person when they're incarcerated, when they're incapacitated. And then guess what? They go right back to the same thing. So there is very little evidence. The other thing is that sometimes just locking people up doesn't work. Think about repeat behavior. In other words, if I keep locking people up, I'm hoping that they will change their behavior because of the continued lockup. But the truth of the matter is that it just sometimes doesn't work, right? We have to find solutions that work. Now, I'm not sitting here, and I want to preface this before moving on. I don't want you to think that I'm saying if somebody breaks the law, they should get a free pass. Absolutely not. Because I've come from law enforcement. I've had a lot of people that I've locked up so many times, and they just didn't get it. And it's like, I'm throwing up my hands. Like, I don't know what's going to change. However, for some people, the notion and idea is that if we keep locking them up and they don't change, what are we going to do to get them to change? And this is why I keep saying with rational choice theory and why it's our baseline theory, it is all about the individual. If they don't want to change, you can't force them to change. Let me say that again. If they don't want to change, you cannot force them to change. So just keep that in mind. So within criminal justice in the rational choice theory, for some people, there is the belief that we should have focused crackdowns. They could be more effective than routine police patrols. Yes, we have to target individuals who decide they want to break the law and want to commit criminal offenses. But if we can go ahead and have a heavier police presence, maybe those people will think twice before trying to break the law. Maybe they'll think twice before committing criminal acts. There's this belief that punishment may deter criminals from committing crime, and that shapes sentencing policy. One of the sentencing policies that we'll get to towards the end of the lecture is 3 strikes and you're outlaws, right? 3 strikes and you're outlaws have been very damaging and they've been controversial in certain communities, but it's this whole idea that if we can't stop you from committing crimes and we give you a first strike, a second strike, and a third strike, then at some point we're going to have to go ahead and just say, that's it, you're out. And we'll get to that in a second. And then you even have your just desserts policies, right? So, that applies fair and reasonable punishment proportionate to the damage or hurt caused by the crime. So making sure the belief and the idea is that, the punishment has to fit the crime, right? So, if you go ahead and you stole something from someone, you can't just go ahead and say, all right, well, because you stole from me, you're going to spend 20 years in prison. That might be applicable if you've had multiple strikes, which is what we'll get into with 3 strikes and you're outlaws. But generally speaking, it has to be proportionate. Crime has to absolutely be proportionate. And I talked about that in another class, how, crime should be proportionate and it should be certain, and it has to achieve certain qualifications to be acceptable in our society. Punishment, not a crime. So when looking at three strikes and you're out laws, this really ties into habitual offender statutes. And the habitual offender statutes mandate that an offender with a third felony conviction should be sentenced to life in prison. Now, what you see on your screen is President Bill Clinton. President Bill Clinton was signing some people will argue, the infamous 1994 crime bill. But this crime bill was birthed out of California. California kicked off this trend with three strikes and you're out. And what that meant is that, hey, if you commit a crime, your first crime, felony crime, or any crime, depending on the jurisdiction, that's your first strike. You do another crime or felony crime, that's your second strike. But when you get that third strike, you're going to prison for life, period. It doesn't matter what that third felony is. It could be something as simple as and I hate to say simple because felonies are serious, but it could be aggravated assault, right? You threaten somebody by swinging a pipe. You didn't hit them, but you threatened them by swinging the pipe, and you got arrested for aggravated assault. That's your third strike. You're going to prison for life. You didn't even hit the person, right? So this 1994 crime bill was very controversial. If this was an in-person class, I would have had a video that I would have played for you all. But you can certainly just go type in and look up President Clinton's 1994 crime bill. And again, there are consequences to that bill that's being felt even today. We're in 2025, folks. So we're talking, nearly 30 years, 31 years, and yet people are still feeling the consequences to the 1994 crime bill with three strikes and you're out. So I believe in talking about other states and what they have, especially in the South, since I live in the South and I've lived in the South. Florida has 10-20 life. 10-20 life is very simple. You pull a gun on somebody, 10 years in prison. You fire a gun, you get 20 years in prison. You shoot someone, it's 25 to life. 10-20 life is also applicable in felony cases too. So you get that first felony. If it's a very serious felony, you can face up to 10 years in prison. Depending on aggravating circumstances of the felony, you might get 20 years in prison. And then if you get that third felony conviction, then that's when you may get 25 to life. But it's very, very, very prevalent when it comes to firearms. Now, Georgia has 7 deadly sins. And here are what the 7 deadly sins are. Murder, taking advantage of a woman, sexual assault, rape, armed robbery with a firearm, aggravated child molestation, aggravated sodomy, aggravated sexual battery, and involuntary manslaughter. Any of these offenses in Georgia is qualified as a 7 deadly sin. If you get that crime, you're automatically looking at a minimum of 10 years in prison. Now, murder, obviously, you're going to get more time. But as you can see, Georgia is very strict. They don't play. When you get that second 7 deadly sin, now you're looking at, 20 plus years in prison. And that third one also would be 25 years to life. So again, Georgia is a very serious state, and these 7 deadly sins, if any of them are committed, it's going to be some substantial prison time. Alabama, on the other hand, has some of the toughest laws in the country. Alabama created the 1979 Habitual Felony Offender Act, or HFOA, and that mandates life imprisonment without parole for persons convicted of a Class A felony having previously been convicted of any 3 felonies. Now, what's amazing about this, and I'm going to go over it in the next slide, is that you could have done any 3 felonies, but if you get a Class A felony, which I'm going to outline, you're going to prison for life, period. You're going to prison for life. So just understand that when we're looking at 3 strikes and you're out laws, every state has some variation of it. And Alabama has some of the toughest in the entire country. So here are the Class A felonies. First degree of that offense, rape. First degree domestic violence. Now listen, first degree domestic violence is interesting, right? Because think about if you're in the state of Alabama and you have a domestic violence dispute or a domestic violence incident with your partner, what is going to be qualified and what's going to classify it as first degree? Is it going to be first degree because, you know, it was aggravated? Or was it going to be first degree because of how the person attacked the other party? But first degree domestic violence is very serious. First degree kidnapping as well. Abducting a victim for ransom, holding someone for hostage. First degree burglary. That's breaking into someone's house. So you know, if you break into someone's house, and if that qualifies as first degree burglary, that's a class A felony. So if you get several first degree burglaries, you're going to prison for life, all because you broke into someone's house. Serious, right? Even offering drugs to anybody under the age of 18. If you're selling drugs to minors, that's another rap too. And arson as well. So the class A felonies, the state of Alabama, they don't play around. The state of Alabama is very, very strict when it comes to how they handle their class A felonies, especially with their Habitual Felony Offender Act, the HFOA. Current data shows more than 500 people are serving life without parole under this law in about 220. So not quite half, but probably about 45 or so percent, 45, 46%, about half, or close to half rather, have this sentence where no one was hurt. So you probably have some situations where maybe it was a first degree burglary, maybe it was offering drugs to anybody below the age of 18. Those are two offenses where no one could have been hurt. Even arson, if you're burning down buildings. The fact that you have 500 people in the state of Alabama serving life without parole under the Habitual Felony Offender Act certainly says that the Alabama's 3 strikes and you're out policies are not one to be played with. You have to be careful if you are considering breaking the law or committing criminal offenses or criminal acts in certain states and jurisdictions, because each state has a different law, and depending on how serious that law is, you could find yourself going to prison for life, you know, before you even really get an understanding of what it means to have these different felonies. You have to be knowledgeable and careful based on whatever state you are in. So we've completed our first chapter looking at rational choice theory, focusing on the baseline, how this is our baseline theory as it relates to all other theories we're going to go into. The key takeaway that I want you to remember, even as we're looking at other theories, is that when it comes to rational choice theory, it is the notion and the idea that, again, an offender will weigh the pros to the cons, the benefits to the costs, and the rewards to the risks of committing a crime. And if those pros and benefits and, you know, rewards outweigh the others, then they will have a crime. If the risks and the costs and the cons outweigh the others on that side, then you will not have a crime. It's an easy concept that we can apply in our everyday life. The next time you think, hey, I want to splurge on some fast food or whatever. I'm just using that as an example. Do you have the money to get the fast food? Or are you broke? Or are you close to broke? Or whatever the case may be. You know, have you been on a diet? Or have you been trying to cut back? Because, you know, it's the summer. You want to get your beach bod. Like, you're going to weigh those pros and cons, right? You got to go to work. And you know that you're running late and you're running behind. You might think twice before doing 75, 80 miles an hour, because you don't want to get a ticket and have to explain to your parents why you got this ticket, or explain to your boyfriend or your girlfriend or your loved one why you got this ticket and why you lost several $100s. So either way, we can apply rational choice theory to our everyday life. So I want to thank you for tuning in on chapter 4. Be sure to tune in on our next chapter, chapter 5, which focuses on trait theory, and I will see you next time.